Good afternoon. I'm here today to talk to you about a buzzword and a topic that we all have heard. It's been passed around in classrooms and in schools since I've been teaching, but rarely do we look at it in detail. I'm talking about critical thinking. Specifically today, I want to talk about how we can create a generation of critical thinkers in our classroom with our students. As we go through the presentation, first I want to define critical thinking. I want to make sure that we're on the same page. We'll talk briefly about what are the benefits of this process of learning for students. And then finally, practical applications, something that often gets left out. A couple of activities that will engage your students and get them to thinking critically and the process of building knowledge by gaining knowledge. So again, creating a generation of critical thinkers, practical applications for the classroom. So to start out, what is it? What is critical thinking? Well, according to Islam, it's a self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitoring, and self-corrective way of thinking. It builds these skills into the way that you actually process and think yourself. A more formal definition. It's the ability to analyze the way that you think and the way that you present evidence for your ideas. It also emulates the scientific method. So my scientist friends and peers will resonate with this. But the scientific method, or the pursuit of reliable, relevant knowledge about the world, this critical thinking follows the same steps, and it builds the same skills within the students. You have content knowledge that's going to increase, procedural knowledge, how do we do things, metacognition, so having the students actually think about their thinking process, and it builds an attitude that uses these individual skills in order to increase knowledge and increase the critical thinking. That's the formal reasons and more of a formal definition. A little more informal is, like this picture, is it brings students together. Knowledge does build knowledge, and when we work together with critical thinking, we see students having better control of their own learning. We see an increase in empathy, working together, understanding other points of view. This increases their motivation, and it improves their writing skills, which is a significant portion of any class at this point when we're in high school. So knowledge builds knowledge. Thinking critically and using these techniques in your classroom, these are the benefits that you're going to see to your students. Ultimately, critical thinking helps you and your students better understand their own experiences and the experiences of others, which is going to make this generation that we are in charge of able to run our country and to interact with each other. So how do we do this? How do we water our young minds and get them to this process of critical thinking so that their brains are working and gaining knowledge and building their own skills? Well, it's difficult because critical thinking itself is not a specific skill that you can teach. It involves a lot of different skills that the students put together, or any critical thinker puts together, and again builds our knowledge. So it's not a particular skill. But how do we have activities that are going to do these things in the classroom? Not only get them critical thinking, but promote their own creativity, encourage our students to reflect, to think about what they've done, what they've learned, ultimately creating independent learners. And finally, and I use this as last because often I've heard peers and myself have thought, well, some of these activities don't seem rigorous. They don't seem like they're actually improving my students' academic performance. So the things that we're going to look at today should meet all of these criteria, including enhancing their academic performance. So one of the first activities that I wanted to introduce you to. I've redefined it, but defining a problem, and this is an ice-breaking activity, so it can be used at the beginning of the year, although you certainly could build this into your instruction and curriculum throughout the school year as well. But again, defining a problem, icebreaker. We know that in critical thinking, one of the first things that you have to do is be specific about what it is that you want to solve. What is the problem that's out there? So this activity helps students by pinpointing a relevant problem. For example, in my class, as an English class, I might use this prompt. What can we do to improve classroom environment while adhering to the COVID-19 guidelines? That's something that would be pertinent to my students, and I would engage them in both writing and discussing this, but we're going to move forward. Another, in general, question that you might use would be, what's the most urgent problem in the world today? You might be surprised at what your students can come up with. Once you have defined the problem, once you've helped students narrow in and focus, and that's the teacher's job in this. Ultimately, they'll define problems, but once you've defined the issue, these are the crucial and critical questions that you're going to follow up with your students. This can be done in dialogue, this can be done in the virtual environment in small groups, or this can be done in a writing. But questions. What are the details of the challenges that we're facing? What do we want to overcome specifically? 3, what do we already know about this topic? Why is that knowledge important? Ultimately, how does it affect you, us, the community that we live in, or our world? And then this last one, where do we begin? And this process has your students thinking critically, taking this problem that's been defined clearly for them and working through what is in effect the scientific method, but this method of critical thinking, and that's what these questions are generating. And again, this could be done in small groups in a virtual environment where 3 to 5 students have their cameras and mics on while the rest of your class is responding or interacting via the chat bar. And this engages that first part of critical thinking, defining the problem and then working through these steps. We know critical thinking is not domain specific. It's a domain general process. So again, this is open for any subject, not just an English class. The idea here is it necessitates defining a problem and then working through the steps of solving it. And your students should be self-motivated and get into this process on their own, and you're just doing the monitoring, less talking. So, defining the problem, icebreaker, is one activity that you could use. A second practical application that'll have your students thinking critically or building this knowledge is called the Virtual Socratic Seminar. And this involves reviewing a topic that you've already covered in class. The activity will engage your students to examine, to think about whatever it is that you've discussed, read, and gone over in a previous classroom. The students need to be familiar with this topic, and they need to come prepared to discuss. There are no specific questions that are asked, although there are some prompts that I'll suggest that you may use. But the students should be familiar enough with the topic that they can carry on a conversation about it. Again, this is done virtually. You'll divide students into an inner circle of 3 to 5 students, tends to be the number that works the best. Those students, your inner circle, will turn their cameras and their mics on, and they will be the inner circle discussion. They'll be the only people in class that are actually verbally talking and interacting with each other. The rest of the class and teacher will use the chat bar in order to make comments or to ask questions as the conversation goes on. You need to allow enough time for these students to engage, somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes, depending on your topic. And silence is okay in this. It's awkward, especially in the beginning, for students to get used to the process. Let them get used to it. It's real tempting for the teacher to jump in and to start filling in those awkward silences. Give it a few minutes and see what your students can come up with themselves. If you need to prompt some conversation, here are some suggestions. You can follow up with where does that idea come from? Open-ended. Or could you say that another way if you see that students are not comprehending? Or what else could that mean? And certainly there are other follow-up questions that you could use that you may come up with on your own. When this activity is over, after you've gone through your designated time, 15 to 30 minutes, you're going to have a time for reflection. And this brings it all together and has all of your students, even those that weren't participating in the actual conversation, processing and thinking critically about the topic. You want to ask these following questions. How was your understanding of the topic affected by listening to others, the opinions and the facts and the proof that others have brought up? What engaged you and what bored you and why? You may come up with a few other reflective questions on your own based on your subject matter and your curriculum. But these, again, will have your students not just participating in the activity, which has them thinking, metacognition, thinking about thinking, it also has them go back and reflect on what they've learned. So the virtual Socratic seminar topic review. Last but not least, a third activity that you can apply in your classroom I've called My Symbol. Who am I? So this activity involves students using prior knowledge of themselves, their background, their culture, and of things that they recognize in order to think non-linearly and to find an object that symbolizes them. So a deeper meaning of a regular physical object, attaching a deeper meaning to it, symbolism. You're going to begin this with a short discussion of symbols. I have several that I can provide to you for samples, or you can come up with your own. You're going to provide some examples and encourage students to participate verbally or in writing by answering what these following symbols mean to them. And you're going to pick some common symbols. The ones that I've had here, for examples, are a dove, an eagle, a rose, and a four-leaf clover. There's certainly others. You may ask for students to come up with symbols that they recognize here. A good place to start there is with sports teams. You'll get a lot of involvement and participation with your students when you bring up mascots and talk about symbolism and what does that mean. The idea here is to get them thinking about these objects and how they can associate a deeper meaning to them. Then you're going to provide them a little bit of time. I've used 5 minutes for this in my virtual classrooms. Depending on your class size and on your students, you can adjust that time period, but a set amount of time. And you're going to ask the students on the spot to go about their house or their rooms to find a symbol, an object that they feel like represents themselves. This can be a quality about themselves or their whole persona. Now you're going to kind of leave that open to them because that's this process of thinking critically. You want them to make the connections between this object and themselves. Once the time period has gone by, 5 minutes here, again, we're going to use this virtual small groups in order to have students interacting, but also make sure the rest of the class has the opportunity to respond as well. The small group of 3 to 5 students, have them turn on their mics, turn their cameras on, and they are going to present their symbol to their group. So in visual, everyone can see the symbol that they've chosen, and then they're verbally going to describe or explain to their group why they chose this particular object. What does it represent about themselves? You can go through this with all of your small groups. If you want to put the time into it, it's well worth it. And each group then has the opportunity, and each individual student, to both speak to the class and have their voice heard, and also to respond in the chat bar when they're not actively involved in the conversation. You're going to sum this up by having the students, in my class, I do this in writing, and this is a skill, they're going to, as homework, they're going to write a paragraph that summarizes and describes the symbol that they've chosen and what it represents about themselves. I encourage my students that if you can say it, then you can write it. And they will have already said it in the group that they presented their symbols to. So again, this is a third activity that can engage your students. It's practical for our virtual environment that we've had, but ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to create a generation of critical thinkers, a generation that knows how to build their own knowledge and that is motivated to do so, and that is able to use this, again, process of metacognition, thinking about their own thoughts and their own process of thinking, so that they come out and they're able to lead us and do it in an educated and professional manner. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to supply. I said I've got some backups as far as symbolism, a short presentation, and I certainly can provide the link for this entire Prezi as well. Thank you for your time.